Hello and welcome, I'm Frostellian and this is my guide for Unholy Death Knights at the end of Warlords of Draenor. Firstly, let me say that I know it's a little delayed, but better late than never. This guide is going to cover everything that you will need to know to perform well in a PvE environment by giving you a strong understanding of unholy mechanics. High-end Death Knights require intensive micromanagement, and since I don't want to baffle anybody, I've stripped out as much of that as possible. One of the first things that players new to Death Knights often ask me is why their abilities are suddenly going on cooldown without warning, and it's because Death Knight mechanics function differently to other classes. Instead of having each ability independent and on its own timer, DK abilities are all tied together onto a shared resource called runes. These runes come in several flavours with different abilities tied to each. Their names are mostly as you would expect. Blood is red, Frost is blue, Unholy is green, and lastly Death, which is pink. We don't start with death runes, they have to be created, but they can then be used on any ability, and so much like life, we want to get as much pink as possible. Runes come in pairs and work like charges. Each rune type has a total of 2 charges, and whilst you can use both, only one of that pair can regenerate at any given time. So the fundamental goal in playing a DK is keeping one from each pair regenerating constantly throughout combat. Using runes generates our second resource, aptly named Runic Power. And by spending this runic power, we are provided in turn with more runes to spend. Okay, building up from scratch, there is some initial fluff we need to get through. Unholy believes it is a pet spec, so you'll need the pet ghoul. Sadly, it's pretty much useless, but we need him because he comes with a dark transformation ability, so make sure he's there. We have several different stances, but will always be an unholy presence, and our group buff is Horn of Winter. We have 2 long-duration dots, which are diseases, and these require minimal management. They are applied using Outbreak or Plague Strike. We need these to always be ticking, and so they simply require reapplication whenever they run out. And now the interesting stuff begins, the core abilities for single target. I'll start with our strongest damaging ability, Scorch Strike. This uses 1 unholy rune, and we want to use this whenever we can. Our second core ability is Festering Strike. This uses 2 runes. Conveniently, a blood rune and a frost rune. This ability has 2 effects baked in. First is to extend the duration of diseases on the target. The second, and more important, is to convert the runes used into death runes. Deciding what to do with these death runes is really pretty simple. Festering Strike and Scorch Strike do roughly the same damage, but Festering costs twice as many runes, so we aim to spend all the death runes on Scorch Strike. The runic power spender for Unholy is Death Coil. By using 3 runes, we will have enough power to spend on a Death Coil. Every time we use Coil, we put a stacking buff on our pet. Once it hits 5, we transform it into an empowered state, where it becomes slightly less useless, which is worth using whenever it pops up. There is also a proc called Sudden Doom that grants a free Death Coil, but always use runes before Death Coil, even with the proc up. Always using runes before Death Coil will keep you out of trouble. Finally, we have the Execute, called Soul Reaper. Executes start early on Unholy at 45%, but since Reaper takes time to activate, feel free to use it sub 50%. Reaper also uses an Unholy rune, and should be used off cooldown instead of Scorch Strike. Essentially, using these 4 buttons is where you'll spend most of your time. So let's do a full cycle of runes to show the rotation, which takes about 30 seconds. We're going to put diseases up, and then put down 1 rune of each pair as quickly as possible, and then keep it that way. Because runes determine which abilities you can use, there is no value in watching action bars or individual abilities. It's all in the runes. Sadly, the default UI really doesn't emphasize this enough, but there are many add-ons for runes out there. My preference is MagicRunes, but just find one you like. So to start, we cast Outbreak, then open with Scorch Strike, then Festering Strike, then Scorch Strike, and Festering Strike, and with runes exhausted, we Death Coil. As you can see, we made some death runes that we now use on Scorch Strikes. So Scorch Strike 3 times, and then Death Coil. And the next set of runes come up, we again Scorch Strike 3 times, and Death Coil. And we're right back to where we started. This is Unholy at its most basic. Okay, so that was single target. Let's look at AoE. We have 2 more abilities, and our first mechanics trap. We have a ground-based effect, Death and Decay, which deals damage over 10 seconds and uses an Unholy rune. You simply throw it on the floor where the mobs are. The other AoE ability we have is Blood Boil, and as expected this uses a blood rune. This works as an explosion around your character, not your target, and has the added effect of spreading your diseases to everything caught in the blast. The trap is that there is no AoE effect for frost runes, which means that you need to plan ahead for the AoE by making sure that you have turned the frost runes into death runes with Festering Strike ahead of when you need them. This makes the whole process of AoEing very unfriendly to new players, but you can get around this by only ever using Blood Boil on death runes. But honestly, I really wouldn't worry about that too much at this stage. The other key piece of information when using Blood Boil is that it maintains death runes. While Scorch Strike turns them back, Blood Boil doesn't, so if you aren't careful with the AoE, you can easily drop your diseases. So let's quickly run through an AoE cycle. We open without break like usual, Scorch Strike, and then turn runes into death with Festering. The difference is when we get our first set of death runes back. So we go Death and Decay, Blood Boil, Death Coil. And as you see, these runes are again coming back as death runes. And then Scorch Strike, Blood Boil, as we have nothing new for the Unholy rune. So the AoE rotation is an even simpler loop without Festering Strike, which is why it's so easy to drop the diseases. Moving on to cooldowns and utility. There is only one cooldown that is Unholy specific, Summon Gargoyle. It's a 3-minute cooldown with no cost, where you guessed it, a gargoyle turns up for a bit and shoots stuff. You can't control it, so just pop it and forget about it. It does benefit from buffs, so try to have them up when you use it. Second is Army of the Dead. The cooldown is 10 minutes and costs 1 of each rune to give you a bunch of ghouls and some runic power. It looks great, but it's trash. You can't control the ghouls, and their damage is pitiful. The only use for this ability is pre-pull to give you some runic power to start the fight. Just make sure you cast it with enough time for the runes to be back up. Aim for about 5 seconds on the countdown, but it's so bad that if you forget to use it, simply don't worry about it. Third is Empower Rune Weapon, and it's very useful. Every 5 minutes it gives you all your runes back, and some runic power. This is all we have in terms of burst damage, so use it wisely. Fourth is Dark Simulacrum, which lets you copy the next spell cast. A lot of spells can't be copied, but they usually leave a few for us. And then we have a few bits of raid utility. First is Death Grip. You pull the thing to your current location. It's very handy for ad management, but it does have an inbuilt taunt. Second is our Combat Raise Ally. It has a default cost of 30 runic power. Third is that whilst we have a basic interrupt on a 15-second cooldown, we also have Strangulate, a ranged silence that costs a blood rune. Considering that several other classes have ranged interrupts, and that it's so expensive, this is a last resort for us. And now defensives. We have 2. Icebound Fortitude is your standard cooldown with a flat damage reduction, but also with a small perk of stun immunity. Anti-Magic Shell is much more versatile. This allows you to convert magic damage into runic power, or if used preemptively, it can sometimes immune the damaging effect. On almost every encounter you can block or soak magic damage using Shell. Moving on to glyphs, stats and talents. Well, stats is really easy. You want to go for strength, then multi-strike, then mastery, and everything else is both worse and equal. For rune forging, you want Rune of the Fallen Crusader. For gems and enchants, go for multi-strike, and potions and flasks are of course strength. As for glyphs, mages are regen magic, blood boil range, combat res, and minors are turning the taunts off, army and grip, with the last minor being whatever you want, like pet skin. And now we finally hit talents. The DK talent tree has several traps for new players, as some talents need specific playstyles, combining with other talents, or just simply shouldn't be used at all. Right, so starting with 57, our go-to will be Purgatory. It's very useful as it gives you 3 seconds grace to be saved after taking fatal damage. But Anti-Magic Zone is an option for raid utility. It's ground-based, so just throw it on the floor over the stuff you want to protect. It's only up for 3 seconds though, so needs good timing. Lichborn doesn't really have a use in PvE. 58 makes you quick, everything else slow, or stuns one thing. Our mobility is just terrible, so usually the answer is Death's Advance, but it can be Chillblains on occasion. Very rarely is anything in a raid stunnable, and even if there is, other classes are much better at this. 75 is Death Pact. The runic cost is too high to make conversion worth taking, Siphon requires planning and reduces your damage, so really Pact will serve you best overall. 90 is Gorfin's Grasp. It's an AoE grip that pulls mobs to your target. As for Remorseless Winter, Other classes have AoE stuns, but only we have an AoE grip. And Desecrated Ground doesn't get much play in PvE. Now we come to the tiers with choices in them. Let's start at level 100. This has the biggest trap to acknowledge if you're a new player. Do not use Breath of Sindragosa. I cannot be more clear about this. You might see on Sims that it does the highest single target DPS, but it is ridiculously punishing. Even if you can accurately plan your resources and the encounter whilst flawlessly micromanaging everything else, you can still cock this up. And if you get this wrong, you are effectively not taking a level 100 talent. The choices left are much simpler to use. Defile is the ability from Lich King, but nowhere near as interesting, because it simply replaces Death and Decay. You throw it on the floor, and tanks pull stuff out of it, but Defile shines in places where there are regular, short bursts of damage on grouped up adds, such as dungeons or encounters without a central target. Lastly, we have Necrotic Plague, which simply replaces both diseases. It gives very stable damage in raids, and is the most user-friendly even in dungeons. It functions by building up to 15 stacks, and will spread itself to another nearby target every time it ticks. So my recommendation to you is to take Necrotic Plague. Now we have our 100 talent, let's look at synergies with tier 56. We can safely ignore Plague Leech. It's very useful in some encounters, but most of the time you won't be needing it. The natural pair with Necrotic Plague is Unholy Blight, but that means you have to actively manage your plague duration by adding in more festering strikes to match Blight's cooldown. And so we are left with Plague Bearer, which has a basic function of adding a stack to Necrotic Plague whenever you death coil. This means that you simply have to keep Necrotic Plague on the target, and then reapply it whenever it happens to drop off. With this, you don't have to manage any timers, just your runes, which believe me, will be quite enough starting out. I really recommend you take Plague Bearer. Now we come to the biggest talent choice that determines not only how you get your runes back, but how the class actually plays and feels. To begin with, we can get rid of the huge trap that is Runic Empowerment. This is outright terrible for every spec, and frankly shouldn't exist, leaving us with Runic Corruption and Blood Tap. They return a similar amount of runes and are competitive at the highest levels, but only Blood Tap encourages the inexperienced user to repeatedly slap himself in the face. The way Blood Tap works is that using Death Coil generates a third resource, which you actively manage to create Death Runes. This is by far the most tricky to use, because improper use of Blood Tap will substantially lower your DPS more than anything else, and really shouldn't be used by any new or even average players. So this leaves us with Runic Corruption. It functions very simply. Using Death Coil has a chance to make all your runes come back really, really quickly. It makes the playstyle very fast-paced, where you need to keep spamming buttons every second or you risk capping resources. The Runic Corruption proc can itself stack multiple times, so there is no risk in ever overwriting it, only in capping your runes. So, considering that flawless use of Blood Tap nets you a similar result to Runic Corruption, but with a lot of extra hassle, I really recommend you take Runic Corruption. So let's put this talent tree together and have a final demonstration. Nothing has changed to the core rotation I did at the start. We've only changed the type of the disease, and occasionally the runes will come back really quickly. But because we never want to risk capping runes, it's very important that you never cast Death Coil when you could be using a rune, and you want to Death Coil the very instant that all your runes are down. This should safeguard you from any rune desync. It might feel a little awkward having a Doom proc up for several seconds, but as long as you don't have runes up, feel free to spam Death Coils till you do. And that concludes this guide. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it helpful. I'll be putting up some more detailing optimized uses of Runic Corruption and Blood Tap soon. Thanks for watching.